Part 3 of a man's covenant. We're in Numbers chapter 15. We'll be there in just a little bit, but I wanted to give just a brief bit of review. Will not take long. We started off this morning in talking about a man's covenant. Paul gets it from Galatians 3:15, that particular phrase, and he takes an illustration from life. Not a single one of us here who would not understand what a man's covenant is. And we do it, people do it every day, probably now 24 hours a day since the advent of the internet and computers and the like. But they enter into covenants. You lease a car, you sign on the bottom line. That is a covenant. You'll pay so much a month for the use of this car. And down the road, if you say in a couple months, well, hey, I'm not going to pay any longer, but I'm going to keep the car. Well, you're going to get in trouble. Why? Because you entered into terms of an agreement, a covenant. You gave your word and so forth. Well, Paul talks about the fact that there will be people, and have been, who are covenant breakers. Who actually, and that's what the Greek means, to reject the terms of the covenant after the agreement is confirmed. Signed on the bottom line, you shook hands on it, you gave your word, you understood completely what was required of you, and yet after you ratified this agreement, you went and broke it. As a matter of fact, the implication is that they had no intention of keeping it. And people are like that, and we learned where it came from, the old sin nature. We'll see that in just a moment. Okay, come on here, fella. Wake up. The next thing that the Apostle Paul talks about, and we're going to give, here we go, is that of the unequal yoke. We'll go there. And the unequal yoke is when you get involved with certain people that are different than you, and that's exactly what it means. The Greek talks about being yoked or bound to people who are different, who have a different agenda, who have a different viewpoint, and the like. And it becomes real difficult as a believer when you are yoked to these type of folks, because you want to serve the Lord. That is the main thing on your mind. That's your priority. So you follow his protocols and learn his thinking. But if you are bound to someone, and we usually use this with regard to marriage, but it's not just marriage. It is anyone who doesn't want to keep the rules and regulations, doesn't want to follow the protocol and so forth, and do things their own way. Here you are plodding along like that ox that we learned about this morning, but you are bound, as it were, to the ass, to the donkey. And he has his thinking and you have your thinking. He wants to go his way, you want to go your way. And the parties pull in both directions. We learned about the principle of the unequal yoke. And it answers the question of Amos 3:3. Can two walk together except they be agreed? And of course, the answer to that is a resounding no. You simply cannot for very long walk together. There has to be general agreement, general direction that you're going as you're moving on in life. All right, the next thing that we learned was with regard to the old sin nature. If you want to know the chief characteristic of this entity that you deal with in your flesh, just mark it down. Paul calls it disobedience. When people don't want to keep the laws, they're under the control of the flesh. And the world is that way, of course, because they are lost and they're undone. And they're dominated by the old sin nature. Now, that doesn't mean that the old sin nature cannot have its nice trend. As you'll note, our little diamond in there where you have the old sin nature. It has two trends. And it also has a blend. One toward legalism, the other toward licentiousness, but these come together. And usually when they come together, it makes for a very beautiful personality, drawing room type character, engaging, very nice in conversation. But they always have an ulterior motive. They're always after something other than what they seem. And of course, the prime example of this is in 2 Corinthians, Paul talks about those who are deceitful workers. Lucifer himself transforms himself into an angel of light. And so he says his followers are going to do the very same thing. So they're very religious, very sanctimonious, very legalistic. But on the other hand, they've got a hidden agenda. They don't want to obey the gospel of Jesus Christ. They don't want to adhere to the rules and regulations for the dispensation of grace. Why? Because they're following their old sin nature, which is characterized by disobedience. All right. What does Paul further say about this entity that we deal with? It is not subject to divine laws, which simply means that if God says one thing, it's going to do another. If God demands one thing, it's going to say, no, I'm headed in another direction. And of course, the prime example of that is Adam. God said, don't eat of the fruit. And guess what? The old sin nature did. It ate of the fruit. Despite the warnings, despite the known consequences, dying you will die, didn't matter. The old sin nature is not subject to divine laws. Okay, now, what we believe here is that in the dispensation of grace, we should be subject to laws. Now, I know people, and this is something I fought with, especially for the years now that I've been in the grace movement. Well, doesn't the Bible say we're not under law, but under grace? And of course, it does say that. And we believe it. Well, if you say, Pastor, we believe that here at our church, then there are no rules and regulations. I actually had a man who was brought up under a grace church, who was on a board of a grace church, to tell me that in a board meeting, that there are no rules and regulations in the dispensation of grace because we're not under law, but we're under grace. And of course, then I reminded him that from the very pen of Paul, he said, let every soul be subject to the higher powers. Those are the institutes of divine establishment, which means if you have a dad, there are rules in that house. If you've got a mom, she can set rules. If you live in a country, it has law enforcement and so forth. And I said, well, you mean to tell me that there are no rules? No, there are no rules and regulations. Do you break the laws of the land? Well, no. Okay, then there are rules and regulations. Now, these rules and regulations come under two categories. First of all, dispensational laws. Now, what that simply means is that God, through history, revealed, and here is your vertical truths. Different times in history, he revealed different things. And a good dispensationalist believes that man must obey or live up to what God has revealed for his time in history. It just so happens we live in the dispensation of grace, and we own up to the revelation that was given to the Apostle Paul. Does that mean we throw out the rest of the Bible? Absolutely not. But I'll tell you what, this morning you probably had bacon and eggs. I know Betty and Tom says that they had chocolate chip cookie was the first thing they had this morning for downstairs in our fellowship hall for breakfast. But bacon and eggs. Now, why did I bring that up? It's simply because if you were under the dispensation of law, you could not have bacon and eggs. It's only under this dispensation wherein Paul tells Gentiles that every kind of food is good for eating if you bless it. You know, well, we can do like the Catholics, I guess. Remember, they came out with if it's on a Friday or if it's on a holy day and it is red meat, you say once liver, now fish, or what have you there. But you can change it. Well, what am I saying? You really don't have to do that. We're not under the dispensation of law. We're under grace. The rules have changed. And therefore, we follow what Paul teaches, even by way of salvation. It is not believe and do something else. It is believe alone in Christ. But then when we come to the laws of divine establishment, we have already studied 10, and we'll get back to those later on. But one of the institutes of divine establishment is a local church. And that's actually what this study is all about. Trying to get back to understanding that there was an agreement made between all of us when we joined a church. There are biblical rules about a church. There are constitutional rules. And we'll discuss the letter of the law and the spirit here in just a little bit. But be that as it may, the laws are still on the books, and they still apply. And for us to try to make excuses, have our reasons other than the legitimate ones, as to why we can't be faithful, is to be under the control of the flesh. Grace believers should be oriented to law in these two categories. Okay. Now there are two, well, here one again. Come on. We're going to go and we're going to get this touchpad fixed. Sorry you've got to wait through this. And that's what happens. This touchpad is just so sensitive. Come on. Should stop at truce breakers where I was before. And I touched it and it didn't. It went on. Okay. What's in nature? Okay, there we go. This is where we wanted to get for our study tonight. Now, there are two interpretations of the laws. We will get that fixed. It's just that, you see, all of my life, I've done things with regard, in a big way with regard to the physical. I played football. I was a power lifter and the like. But when it comes to this itsy bitsy touchpad here, it doesn't do me any good, because I try to touch it real easy, but boom, and then I got to go back and redo the whole thing. There's certainly got to be a sensitivity switch on it, for me, a sensitive guy, like I am anyway. So we're at the two interpretations of the law. And we looked at this morning. All we're doing is trying to bring you up to date by way of a quick review as to where we left off. And the interpretation of the law. We contend that there is a necessity for understanding the letter of the law and the spirit of the law. Now, for those who constantly want to enforce the letter without any mercy, without any grace or understanding, that there are contingencies in life for some laws, and that you have to understand that things do happen. The Pharisees were that way. Jesus said that these Pharisees bind men to burdens without helping them by lifting a finger to alleviate their suffering, their agony. They just keep on piling law after law and rule after rule, and they don't help men. And if you dare, let life just in the least make you breach one of these laws, we're going to stone you to death, and so forth. And that's the letter of the law, and that's being legalistic. That's what legalism is. Looking at a law and saying, it's got to be enforced constantly by the letter without understanding that things happen. But then on the other hand, this old sin nature, it's a sly old dog. The old sin nature says, well, since we're not under any laws in grace, supposedly, shall we sin that grace might abound? Why don't we just go ahead and live it up? The Apostle Paul says in Romans 6, God forbid, wait one second. If you sin, you're breaking the law. And God doesn't want you to sin, because if you sin, you're allowing the old sin nature to master your life. So you have to understand laws in these two ways. First of all, the letter. That's the strict application. Now, we believe that there are times when the strict application must be enforced. We talked about the speed limit. Okay? If everybody's going to become a law unto themselves, if everybody's going to, book of Joshua, do which is right in their own eyes, if everybody's going to drive at different speeds when the speed limit is set for a legal speed, then you're going to have problems and difficulties. So what's the answer? A strict application of the law. 55 in this area means 55. But as I said, what if there's something happening? What if a parent is dying in a hospital? A wife is giving birth? What if your child has just had an accident? Would it not be more merciful and lenient to allow someone to speed? We allow the ambulances to do so. Under normal circumstances, they must keep the letter. But if they've got somebody that they've got to rush to the hospital, we allow them to break the law in its spirit. That's the right thing to do. It's the lenient exception. But under normal circumstances, the strict interpretation should be enforced. Now, we're in Numbers chapter 15. Verse number 27. If any soul sin through ignorance, then he'll bring a she-goat to the first year and offer it. The priest shall make an atonement for the soul that sins ignorantly. Now see, here's the spirit. If he had known it, he probably would not have sinned. He was ignorant of this particular type of law, and so God says, all right, wait one second. We need to rethink this by way of strict interpretation. He was ignorant of it. There were extenuating circumstances. Let's not be so hard on this guy. He sinned ignorantly. Let's make an exception for him. So, the one that sins by ignorance before the Lord, to make an atonement for him, it shall be forgiven. You'll have one law for him that sins through ignorance among the Israelites and the strangers. All right, but verse number 30. But, it says, the soul that doeth presumptuously. Now, that simply means he knows the law, he knows what's right, he knows that there are consequences, and he does it anyway. In that case, now you'll remember that Jesus Christ is the God who revealed the law to Moses in his pre-incarnate form. It's Christ himself that is going to give the instructions to stone this guy. Now, what is Christ going to require? The letter of the law. What did he do? He broke the Sabbath day. And the law is clear. Anybody who does any work on the Sabbath day is going to be killed, punished. Verse number 30 again. The soul that doeth presumptuously, whether he is born in the land or a stranger, that soul shall be cut off from among his people. Why? Because he despised the word of the Lord. The letter of the law was clear, and yet he said, I disrespect it. Doesn't apply to me. I'm going to do what I want to do. I don't care what God or man has said. I'm going to oppose the letter of the law. So, while the children of Israel were in the wilderness, they found a man gathering sticks upon the Sabbath day. And they found him gathering sticks. They that found him brought him to Moses and Aaron, to all the congregation. Now, you'll remember that. And here's another good one of understanding dispensational laws. They had a preparation day for gathering their sticks, cooking their food, preparing for the Sabbath, so they did not have to work. And I know that probably most of you moms out there wish sometimes you'd be able to have a preparation day so that on Sundays you wouldn't have to work. I know sometimes my mom would put on a big feast on Sundays and so forth. Wouldn't go to church, but we still had a big feast. Now, that's why they had a Jewish preparation day before the Sabbath, to do all their stick gathering, cooking, preparation, so that they wouldn't have to do it. Here was a guy who knew the law, and he disregarded it. They put him in ward, verse number 34, because it was not declared what should be done to him. The Lord said to Moses, the man shall be surely put to death. All the congregation shall stone him with stones without the camp. So all the congregation brought him without the camp, stoned him with stones, that he died, as the Lord commanded. Now that's the strict interpretation of the Sabbath law with somebody who sinned presumptuously, willfully, knowingly, knowing the consequences. But let's go to the book of Matthew, chapter 12. The same Christ who required a man's death for breaking the Sabbath law also talks about a merciful application of it. Matthew chapter 12. Verse 1. At that time Jesus went on the Sabbath day through the corn, it's wheat field. His disciples were an hungered and began to pluck the ears of corn and to eat. Now, wait 1 second. What is this on the Sabbath day? The Pharisees said to him, behold, your disciples do that which is not lawful upon the Sabbath day. And he said to them, have you not read what David did when he was hungered? They that were with him entered into the house of God and ate the showbread, which was not lawful for him to eat, neither for them which were with him, but only for the priest. Now, what was it? David was being hounded by Saul. He needed, as he was going, he was the anointed one of God. Saul was trying to kill him. He didn't have time to take food. There were extenuating circumstances. Where do I go to get food now? I know there's showbread in the tabernacle, and I can go get it. And God forgave David for doing it. He did not punish him. And it was something that he should not have had. What did God do? He allowed for the spirit of the law to be followed. Under normal circumstances, David would not have gone in there. David would not have been presumptuous. But to preserve David's life and his entourage, David went in there, and God said that's well and good. And so Jesus said, my disciples haven't had anything to eat, and they're going through the cornfield. A couple handfuls of grain is not going to kill anybody for them picking it on the Sabbath day. Understand that the Sabbath was made for man, and so forth. Have you not read, verse number 5, in the law, that on the Sabbath days the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are blameless? Guess what? Guess who works on the Sabbath day? Priests do. Now, I know there are those of you who don't think that a, quote, minister works on just one day a week on Sunday, and that's only one time during the worship service and the like. But that's nonsense. But the point that Christ is making here is that, yes, that's right. No one else is allowed to work. But the priests are allowed to work. The priests are allowed to do their job. They can offer sacrifices, clean their utensils, and so forth throughout the whole Sabbath day. What is that? That is an exception to the rule. The rule is no work. The exception is the spirit of the law, the priests have to work. So, verse number 7. But if ye had known what this means, I will have mercy and not sacrifice, ye would not have condemned the guiltless. Mind you, he's referring to David, the priest, and what he was doing on the Sabbath day. He was not guilty of any crime because there the spirit of the law took over, not its letter. Under normal circumstances, Jesus Christ would not have done any work on the Sabbath day. His custom was to go to church, Luke chapter 4. But these were not normal circumstances. They were far from home, without food, and so forth. Now, let's move on here. He went, verse number 9. He departed then and went into their synagogue. Behold, there was a man who had his hand withered. They asked him, saying, Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath days, that they might accuse him? He said unto them, What man shall there be among you that shall have one sheep, and if it fall into a pit on the Sabbath day, will he not lay hold on it and lift it out? How much then is a man better than a sheep? Wherefore it is lawful to do well on the Sabbath days. Under normal circumstances, you did not tend your sheep as such on the Sabbath days. But if one of your animals got in trouble and was bleeding loudly, and it was going to die, it was in agony, wouldn't it be more merciful to just simply go on the Sabbath day and lift it out and help that sheep? And the answer is absolutely. That's the spirit of the law. It is a lenient exception to what otherwise would be a very stern punishment in application of working on the Sabbath. Okay, let's move on here. And let's talk about binding with an oath. Let's go back to the book of Galatians chapter 3. The book of Galatians chapter 3. We're in diagram number 7. Now, this morning someone asked me, did I misspelled yoke? Did I also misspell swear? And I said, no, I didn't. It's Old English. It can be spelled S-W-E-A-R or S-W-A-R-E. And so I took it right from Hebrews chapter 6. I did not misspell it. It is biblical to swear. Have you sweared biblically today? Okay. What we're talking about is, yes, it is biblical to swear. Let me qualify that. In the dispensation of grace, we do not make oaths or vows to God as they did in the Old Testament, which means that, Lord, if you'll do this for me, I'll do this for you. That's Old Testament theology. We do not do that. We do not have any bargaining chip. Anything we get is by way of God's grace. So we don't say, okay, God, I'll live for you if you do this for me. It's grace. You didn't deserve the salvation you got. You don't deserve anything else that you got. And so therefore, it's the grace of God that's going to provide for you. Logistical grace or a superabundant grace as you mature and grow in the Lord. However, as we've already said, there are times when we bind ourselves with an oath. We give our word. Now, one of the places that we do this, again, is in a local church setting. And I'm reminding us all of this because we don't live unto ourselves here in a church. If there is such a thing as fellowship, koinonia, if there's such a thing as commonality, then when we come together, we tell one another that we're going to live up to certain standards, certain terms. There are certain things that we agree to. Other than that, there will be some people who will be responsible for the ongoing ministry of a church, and others who will shirk their duties. Now, the Apostle Paul says in verse number 15, I speak after the manner of men, though it be but a man's covenant. Yet if it be confirmed, no man disannuls or adds thereto. So the concept is, even in the unsaved world, men understand giving an oath and binding themselves to a covenant. Local church people should do the very same thing. There are rules and regulations which govern us by way of our testimony, by way of attendance, by way of giving, by way of responsibilities, and so forth. Now, as I said that, please note, that's the letter of the law. We also understand the spirit of the law by way of church attendance. If you're sick and can't come, we're not going to stone you if you're not there. The work schedule that folks have nowadays, and you can't come to every service. Okay, fine. That's the spirit of the law. Other things happen, and we have mentioned these on down through the course of the year, so you know the list that we have. There are bona fide reasons to miss. But if you miss because you're simply being lazy, if you miss because I don't want to hear that particular study and so forth, then those things are not bona fide. And we believe it is an act of disobedience because everyone else has to be there. Everyone else has to do their part. Everyone else has to make sure that the lights are on, the air conditioning is a set temperature, and that things are kept. Everyone else has to study. But if you want to be the exception when you have no valid excuse, we believe that's sin. That's the letter of the law and should be applied. Again, there's the Spirit. And Paul says it's a man's covenant. It's something that we agreed to. Now, verse number 15 again. If it be confirmed. Kuroo. Kurios is the word for lordship. Jesus Christ is Kurios. He is Lord. But what does that mean? It means that Jesus Christ has authority. This particular word is a derivative of that word. Why does Paul, the King James people translated it confirmed, why does Paul use this word? Because the oath or the terms of the agreement becomes our authority. That's what he's saying. Now, prior to your agreeing to it, has no bind over you, has no authority. You can do what you want to do. You can turn your back. You can snub your nose. You can give it a cold shoulder. No, I'm not going to agree to that, and what have you. But as soon as you say, I'll do it, and understand the implications, it becomes your Lord. So that's why he uses this word. And this word means to make valid by equal ratification. It is not only my Lord when I say I'll do it, it is your Lord. In actuality, you have created a reality to live by. You know what that means? In just a few months, it's Christmas. And I'm going to try this year to refrain from ranting and raving about Christmas. I promise myself every year. But what is reality? Well, people live in a fantasy world prior to Christmas and going through all these things. Why? Because of a plastic credit card. This plastic money, and they take it and they buy this and they buy that, and of course nothing comes out of their pocket except this plastic credit card, and it begins to pile up and the like. It doesn't matter. You got to keep up with the Joneses, and you buy here and you buy there, living in this fantasy world as they play the Christmas carols and they have all these lights and all these sales going on, and you just have to have this and this one for this one and so forth. And the bills pile up and you're living. I mean, Tinkerbell is your servant and the like, carrying your gifts to the car. You're just handing it out because it's fantasy. Then all of a sudden, round about the middle of February, reality. You gave your word. You made an oath that you would pay for all of this stuff, and now you can't do it. So, anyway, it becomes your reality. It's going to govern your life one way or the other. It's going to extract from you the cost. If you're not going to pay for it, somehow it's going to get its money from you. But the same thing applies with a church. We have rules and regulations, we have a constitution and the like. And once we say we're going to do it, it becomes our reality. Not to do it is fantasy. Now again, not to do it under the spirit of the law concept is understood. It's built into the system. But not to do it because we agreed but don't intend to do it is sin. And we have to understand that. Sometimes, as believers, things happen to us and we wonder why. Well, are you living up to what you swore you'd do? That's an important question to ask. Am I living up to my commitment and dedication to what I said I'd do to a local church? Am I giving what I should? Am I attending like I should? Do I do my part in living in the world as a good testimony to this church? Or do I have to tell them that I'm from some other church down the road down there? Or am I living up to what the Constitution and the Bible says I should do as a member? It's important to ask that. If we're not doing it, we believe it's sin and judgment's going to follow. All right. So if it be confirmed. Now, one of the things here, as we're reading verse number 15, no man disannulleth or addeth thereto. When you bind yourself with an oath, you solemnly swear to abide by the terms. And you'll note the arrows in the illustration come back to you. They were your words. They were your intentions. You understood the ramifications, and therefore the person that's going to carry them out is you. I like when the author of Hebrews talks about God making an oath. He said, men always swear by the greater. And so we have to raise our right hand to God and say, I swear to tell the truth. So help me God. But who's God going to raise his hand to? I mean, there's no God before him. There's no God after him. There's no God higher than him. I mean, where's he going to go to say, God vouch for me? So you know what he had to do? He swore by himself, his own integrity. Now, the fact of the matter is, if we're going to be godly, there are times when that applies to us. I said it. I'm responsible for it. I'll carry it out. And so that's what it means to be bound with an oath. It becomes my Lord and my governor. Okay, let's move on here. Let's note the two words that we find in verse number 15. If it's confirmed, Paul says, no man disannulleth. Apheteo is the Greek word. And it means to make the compact void or ineffective as to an obligation. We've already mentioned this. Leasing a car. Not going to pay for it. Fine, we'll repossess the car. Buying some furniture. You're not going to pay for it. Fine, we'll repossess the furniture. Now, why? You didn't live up to the terms of the bargain. You made the terms ineffective. You understood what was required of you, but you didn't carry through with your particular responsibility. And so that's what the Apostle Paul is saying here. You put this thing into effect. It's something that has been mutually put into effect, and now you cannot disannul it. Oh, I was just joking. I was doing it, but I was just kidding you. You can't do it. Make it void one day and in effect the next day. That's something that Paul says, once it's in effect, you're not allowed to do. You can't back out of it unless there's that general understanding that that's what you've done. All right, the second word he uses, or addeth thereto, epidiatasomai. Now, tasso has to do with arranging things in a hierarchy, as it were. Epi means overall, and dia, through. But when you have them put together in this triple compound type word, it means to arrange the terms in addition to or after the fact. This is what I agreed to, but now this is what I'm going to do. And the guy's going to say, wait 1 second. That's not what we agreed to. Here it is in writing. You're going to pay so much a month for so many months with so much interest, and that's the way it's going to be. Here is your imprimatur. Here is your signature, and this is the way it's going to be. And so the Apostle Paul says it's that way in the world out there, the unsaved, but it's that way in the world of the Christian. We understand going in what is required of us, and we agree to it. Now, you will note here that in our illustration, first of all, we have mutual responsibility. One person understands what they're supposed to do, the other person understands what they are supposed to do, and it's written down in the terms of the contract. So the first person extends his hand and the second person extends his hand, and they shake, ratifying the deal. Once it is made, you can't go back on your word without it reflecting on your character. Nor can you say, okay, well, that's what we originally agreed to, but now it's going to be this way. No. The other person has to agree to it and change the terms that you first agreed upon, or else the original document stands as it is written. And that's the important thing to understand. In our church, we have that. We have the Bible, we have the Constitution, we have rules and regulations, we have bylaws, we have ongoing things that people are responsible to live up to. And most folks don't understand that whenever they join a church. And I'm not talking about new ones, I'm talking about all of us. That when we joined the church, it became incumbent upon us to try to fulfill what is required of us. Now, let's go back to Romans chapter 13. We just have a few minutes left. Romans chapter 13. And in keeping with this, we're going right to the words of Paul again. And he says in verse number 8, owe no man anything. Now, what is he talking about? Just paying your bills? That's involved. But owe no man anything means to not owe them anything that you have sworn to in your life. Don't welch. Don't renege. Don't neglect. But to love one another. Why? Now do we have rules and regulations in grace? Absolutely. For he that loves another has fulfilled the law. He keeps his end of the bargain. Why? That is an act of love to the other fellow. If he swore that he was going to pay so much to the other fellow who sold him whatever, and he doesn't do it, then the other fellow has to keep the wolf away from his door because we didn't do our part. That's not an act of love, to cause one man difficulty because we swore to something we had no intention of fulfilling. And the Apostle Paul says, love is the fulfilling of the law. So verse number 10, as we close out. Love, therefore, works no ill to his neighbor. Therefore, again, he says, love is the fulfilling of the law. There are laws, rules, and regulations in the dispensation of grace to be followed. They're there across the board in the Institutes of Divine Establishment. They're there in a local assembly to which we bind ourselves collectively to a course of action, to a doctrinal statement, to a collective testimony to the world.